"You will never bear children." The words were small and precise, as if Doc Morrison had cut them from the quiet corner of his office and laid them on the table between them. He did not raise his head. His fingertips rested on a ledger, his spectacles caught the light from the sash window and sent a thin rectangle of glare across the maps tacked to the wall. Outside, Silver Creek lay in the hard gold of late afternoon, dust and sun, and the low hum of summer. Inside, the world narrowed to the chair Grace Keller sat in, and the shape of the sentence that would not leave her. She had imagined a dozen endings to the fever that had stolen so much that winter, scenes of recovery, of steady convalescence, of a slow return to the schoolhouse with cheeks again flushed by children's laughter. She had not imagined a verdict spoken in a doctor's parlor that sounded like an injunction. There was shame in the geometry of the room, as if all the lines pointed to what she could not become. Breath came too fast. For a moment she watched Doc Morrison's lips move with the small kindnesses he added afterwards, the ways he softened the edges, the warmth he offered, the attempts to name remedies for grief. They reached her like distant rain. She heard them without meaning them. He folded his hands and said plainly that fever could lay waste in ways not always visible, that sometimes a body needed more than time. When she left the office, the sky was the color of old brass. She swung into the saddle with hands that would not be steady, urging Penny along the road out of town. The mare moved as she always had, steady, a promise of sure feet across rock and sand. Grace found the rhythm of riding and held to it like a prayer she did not trust to speak aloud. The townsfolk gave her room as she passed. Mrs. Whittaker, who kept the boarding house where Grace still took her supper on Thursdays, and where she kept a small chest of books, tipped her sunbonnet in quiet recognition. Word, once let out of a doctor's room, traveled with the wind. Grace felt the knowledge of it like a second skin. She rode until the sun burned near the horizon and the sky dropped its light into the long blue hush of evening. Fields of sage rolled away on either hand, the smell of resin rising when she nudged Penny to take an easier pace. She had escaped Boston for the Territory 3 years before, following a desire for space, for the simple work of teaching in a school where she could give the children a world greater than the one they had been born into. She loved books and the cadence of a lesson. She loved the small, careful rebellions of children, how a boy tried to alter the moral of a story, and how a girl would hide a poem beneath her apron. But beneath that teacher's steadiness, beneath the daily rows of arithmetic and the soft hush of story time, there had been a private architecture of longing, a household filled with laughter, a row of small heads at her knee, a life made full in ways that could be counted in bedtime songs and scraped knees and the steady accumulation of moments. The diagnosis did not simply rewrite plans, it undid an imagined identity as if a seam had been severed. She had been widowed once, long enough ago that the ache had grown familiar, a dull companion, when fever had taken her husband during the winter of the great sickness. After that, she thought she had rebuilt from the ruins, lessons ready by sunrise, a small room at Mrs. Whittaker's, the occasional letter from an old friend in Boston. She had kept her longing close, ashamed sometimes, as if it were a private failing. The doctor's words turned shame into something heavier, more honest. They made the private visible. She rode on until her fingers went numb, and her cheeks were pale with the cold that follows a day of such heat. Only when the road dipped and the land opened to the view of the Forrester place did she allow herself to slow. The Forrester ranch sat on a rise of land, a cluster of buildings half hidden by cottonwoods. She had seen Jackson Forrester at town once or twice, a practical sort of man, broad-shouldered, a rancher who wore work in his face. He was known to be a widower with a bright-faced daughter who loved the plays he could not quite keep at bay at the breakfast table. She had meant to pass by without stopping. She had not meant to let the river of people who had known pity and saw in her a vulnerability decide what she should be. He was there before she reached the gate, on the edge of his porch, a figure against the late light. He lifted a hand in a small, unassuming salute. When she drew near, he had already swung down from his own horse. He had the look of a man accustomed to deciding quickly. He tied his mount with the practiced knots of a life that required steadiness and the spare tools to achieve it. His face, when he turned, handsome in a way that belonged to seasons of weather more than to any fashion, carried traces of loss in the soft lines around the mouth. His hair had the sun-bleached tops of a man who had ridden often. "Miss Keller," he called, as if the name were a small, precise thing. He came to meet her at the gate with an ease that was a kind of safety. You were riding hard. She opened her mouth once, the words collapsed into nothing. He looked at her then more attentively, the casual posture gone. Is something wrong? He asked, and his voice held a plain concern that made her cheeks hot. For a long moment she simply looked at him, at the way his jaw tilted, at the way his hands were calloused and capable, at the soft shawl draped over his arm for Abigail to wear when evenings grew cold. Perhaps it was the look of being seen, really seen, that made the tears come then, sudden and shamed. She turned her face to the mare and swiped at her cheek with the back of her hand. Penny snorted and stamped a hoof. Jackson did not ask for an explanation right away. He offered instead the sort of practical assistance his life had taught him to offer. A lead for the mare, a place to tether, an invitation to come inside and dry. The Forrester home smelled like bread and hay, and the faint tang of soap and wood smoke. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, was bustling about as if she had expected disaster and been making ready for it all morning. There were extra quilts folded upon the settle and a kettle singing upon the stove. Come in, Miss Keller, she said, with the hospitality of someone who had reared many through small emergencies. We'll get you warm. Grace inhaled the scent of baking and coffee, and, for the first time since she had left Doc Morrison's office, felt the small relief of being sheltered. She tried to fold herself into the courtesy expected of a guest, but the tautness in her chest was a thing that polite manners could not smooth. As they sat near the fire, Jackson took up the conversation with the easy domestic subjects she had grown tired of hearing, and yet that, in the present, were like soft cloths around raw skin. Abigail's been practicing a speech from The Merchant, he said, and in the name of the play there was an unmistakable pride. She goes on about Portia as if she's a lady grown. Portia does have good lines, Grace said, before she had quite arranged the sound. The mention of Shakespeare tugged at something that kept her steady. It had always been a small joy of her teaching. She read aloud when the children begged, letting the cadence carry them as if the words themselves were shelter. Jackson's mouth warmed into a genuine smile. You teach here, at the school? I do, she answered. Full days. Little ones that never understood why I liked the big words but liked them just the same. They talked around what lay heavy. He asked about the fever in the winter, about whether she missed town life, about the patterns of the school year. Grace let some of the ordinary facts come out. The rest she kept folded in like a letter she had not yet dared to open. Jackson listened as if the ordinary things mattered, and in that listening his gestures were a salve. He fetched a wool shawl when the room grew too cool. He arranged a seat closer to the stove in a way that made it plain no one would glare at a woman who needed warmth. When at last she told him, because the weight of it had become too large to carry in silence, she did so with the careful economy of someone used to setting things down and leaving them. Doc Morrison was plain, she said, her voice small in the room. He told me the fever damaged what it needed to. He said it would be unlikely for me to bear children. Jackson sat back from the stove. In his face, no pity showed averted, no clumsy attempt at consolation. Instead, there was a look that had come to him often since his wife had died, a sort of companionable grief that recognized another's sorrow and named it without trying to fix it with platitudes. He set down his cup with a certain deliberateness. I'm sorry, he said. There's no other way to say it that will make it less true. I'm sorry. His hand went to the edge of the table, fingers curling around a mug as if steadying himself. Grace's shame came up like a fever. I had hoped... She broke off. The image of a house with small chairs at the table rose as inevitably as a tide. I've been careful to keep it to myself. I supposed... She could not finish. To say aloud what she had always held in secret made it strange, less a dream and more a hollow in her hands. Jackson's look did something small and terrible and kind. He leaned forward. You need not keep such things alone, he said. I know what it is to be left with the empty half of a life. The confession, his then hers, hung between them. He told her, not as a boast, but as a fact of weathered life, of his Emily and the winter that had taken her and the child the fever had claimed along with her. He spoke simply of the emptiness that followed, of the small stumbles he had made in the months after, and of his daughter's fierce, bright presence who had become then both solace and sharp reminder. There was no melodrama in his voice, only the precise lines of a man who had learned to name things and to go on. In the kitchen the kettle hummed and the rain began as a thin sound at the eaves. Outside the wide plain darkened. Jackson looked through the window toward the low horizon and then back at Grace. "The clouds are coming in," he said. "You had best stay the night. It's not proper, maybe, but there'll be no place for you to go after this." She should have refused. Courtesy, the manners learned in Boston drawing rooms and in Mrs. Whittaker's kitchen, urged the correct refusal, to decline favors, to manage one's emotions in public. Yet the thought of another night alone in her own room at the boarding house, with the map of Doc Morrison's words traced across the inside of her skull, made the small offer of shelter at the Forrester place seem like a path into something like safety. She accepted. They brought her into the main house where Abigail was already there, a girl with dark hair and an intensity that made her seem older than 15. She held an open book, the pages worn at the edges, and when she saw Grace, she rose with a quick, shy politeness. Her face was bright with curiosity and a hunger for companionship. She looked from Grace to Jackson as if trying to measure whether this guest would be a temporary note in the household or something more durable. "Abigail," Jackson said, "this is Miss Keller from town. She keeps our country school in Silver Creek." Abigail's eyes widened with a sudden impulsive affection. "We had a lesson about Portia last week," she announced, as if that were both an introduction and a case for immediate kinship. "Mr. Forrester says Portia's reasoning is the keenest sort, but I prefer Cleopatra." Grace smiled despite herself. The simple fact of being greeted without pity, the prompt spike of applause for a literary preference, eased something in her chest she had thought permanently knotted. The storm rolled in with a force that made the trees bow. The wind took up the low fields and whipped them into a rush. Rain pounded the tin roof, and the house answered with the old music of water and wood. Inside, lanterns cast a warm pool of light. Mrs. Henderson moved about the room bringing crockery and more blankets. Jackson had Penny stabled and grooming brushed into neat leather on a bench. His own mare, sponged and rubbed, stood smelling of sweat and oats. He took charge with the quiet that comes to a man used to managing households and herds. He gave instructions to Mrs. Henderson, made sure Grace had a bedchamber with a window that would let out the last of the storm, placed a knitted shawl around her shoulders as if this were the most natural courtesy he could offer. There was a decency to him that did not ask to be thanked. It came like bread on a table, necessary, steady, given without fanfare. Before Grace could move to the room, Jackson lingered in the kitchen, wiping his hands on his pants as if uncertain how to keep himself hands-off of the small intimacy of shared dwelling. "There's a spare dress of Emily's," he said suddenly. "It won't fit you to the letter, but it's clean and dry. Mrs. Henderson says it's for such cases." Grace looked at him, startled. The notion of wearing another woman's dress carried with it the relic-like quality of grief, a small appropriation of a life lost. But the dress was a practical thing, a piece of cloth that could hide the wet and give her steadiness in a night that was otherwise uncertain. If she had been in a different state of mind, she might have refused on principle. Instead, she found herself accepting the garment with both gratitude and an odd small grief. To wear Emily's dress would mean a closeness with a life she had never shared, a borrow of someone else's past to keep her company for one night. It was, she thought, a symbol of the way lives braided on the frontier, neighbors lending linens, men taking on small domestic tasks, housekeepers who managed the comings and goings as if they tended the town's heart. In the small bedchamber, the dress hung on a peg and looked less like a talisman and more like an ordinary thing. Grace undid her riding skirt and set it aside, feeling the damp cling to her calves. She changed hurriedly and then studied herself in a shabby mirror. The dress fit oddly at the shoulders, the fabric falling in an unfamiliar line across her chest. It was not Emily's face she was trying on, it was a posture. She did not become another woman in the act of changing. She felt, instead, like a guest who had been offered the seat nearest the fire. She slept that night in a way that was both exhausted and unnatural. The storm was a percussion that beat through her dreams. She woke once to the house's hushed movements, Mrs. Henderson moving about, the rain abating to a softer sound. She could have gotten up and gone back to her little room at Mrs. Whittaker's, could have turned her face from the safe harbor the Forrester home had provided, but something in the worn fabric of Emily's dress seemed to suggest that she make a small tentative stay of the present. She kept herself in the space where care had been given to her without pity. In the morning, the world had been washed and softened. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Abigail came in bright-eyed and speech-practiced, carrying a tattered volume of Shakespeare as if it were a charm against ordinary sorrows. She had read the night through by the fire and now wanted to recite alone to someone who would listen. "Do you know Portia?" she asked, sliding into a chair as if she had been waiting for this exact conversation. Grace laughed, the sound small, surprised, something like the quiet uncoiling of a long-held knot. Abigail's presence was quick and open-hearted in a way that disarmed social cautions. "I do," Grace said, "and I think Cleopatra has the more restless soul. Portia is steadier." Abigail's face lit. "Mrs. Henderson says you're a good teacher. She says the children look at you like you keep the sun coming." There was a folly in the compliment. So much of her life had been work and duty, but it warmed her. "I keep the sun to the lessons that matter," she said, and the two of them laughed at the small private joke. It was a domestic sound, the sound of two people finding an agreeable world in the middle of ordinary things. At breakfast the conversation slipped eventually to a franker place. Jackson brought in a pan with eggs and bacon and set it down with the sort of practical pride one takes in a meal done well. He watched Grace while she ate, his gaze a steady thing that never turned prying, only attentive. "Miss Keller," he said finally, when the ordinary shrank and the quieter questions had room to stand up and be seen, "if you'll have me, I'd like to be of use, not just tonight. If you'll let someone in, let a neighbor know that you're not alone." She looked at him. The offer was not romantic in the hurried way of a novel's declarations. It was quieter. It had the timbre of a man offering his hand across a chasm without making a spectacle of the crossing. She had been offered such hands before, in letters, in the proprieties of small communities, and she had sometimes turned them down for the sake of pride. This was different. His story, his losing of Emily and the child, his slow learning to read for someone else and to fill a house again, did not cancel hers, nor did hers diminish his. They fit instead, like two halves of a pattern that could be joined without erasing the original edges. He spoke then, in a voice that had a softness to it, not the bravado of a man trying to fix things but the plain intention of someone who had met sorrow and learned to act in spite of it. "Your worth," he said in a way that made the words matter because of their simplicity, "is not measured by what you can or cannot do to a body. There's more in a woman than that, and there's more in a life than a single line of need." She had expected other reactions, words of pity, attempts to cheer it away, the small cruelty of well-meaning strangers who insist they know what is best. Instead, he offered a different language, an acceptance that turned the room into a place where grief could be named and not be responded to by a trick of quick fixes. It was, she felt, the first grace she had been given since sitting in Doc Morrison's office. "I don't know how to be," she began, and then stopped. She had been a teacher, yes. She had been a woman who had attempted to stitch meaning into other people's days, but she had not had to reconstruct the blueprint of her life before. "I don't know what comes after a sentence like that," she admitted, and there was no theatricality to it. She was simply for the first time telling a truth. Jackson reached across the table and placed his hand near hers. It was a small contact, nothing showy, but it conveyed something stronger than sympathy. A promise, if promises could be given quietly, that she might be allowed to be something new, without the old dream's disappearance being the only definition. "Then let's begin by not making all the plans at once," he said. "There's time to figure ordinary things. We'll feed the mare. Abigail will make you laugh if you let her. We'll do our part, and no more, one day at a time." It was the most sensible comfort she had heard. Grace found herself nodding, the motion smaller than it would have been if she had felt lighter. Yet there was a new line drawn across the map of her life, a route that led somewhere she had not expected, somewhere that might be kinder than the one she had known. They spent the rest of the morning in small domestic choreography, Jackson mending a fence when the rain had cleared the field and left the ground soft, Abigail showing Grace a seam in a book and then insisting on reading a speech aloud, Mrs. Henderson bringing out warm bread and laying hands on elbows to pat the dough in ways that made things like grief seem less isolating and more community work than private shame. Grace, for her part, taught the children in a small parish room where she had once held school, reading aloud some of the passages she loved. Her voice found its old cadence among the small heads bent over slates. For a moment the surgeon's line not to bear children felt remote, as if her usefulness could be counted in syllables and the attention of young faces. There was a point in the afternoon when Jackson came by the schoolhouse to fetch Abigail for the day's chores. The sun had drawn long shadows across the plain. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way Grace's hands moved over a slate as she corrected a sum. There was a tenderness in the way he watched that did not seek to possess, it simply observed. When the last child had been sent home and the schoolhouse had been closed and the board swept, Grace found herself walking back toward the Forrester place with a quiet in her chest that had not been there a week before. She had not planned the future. She had not intended to ask him for anything. But companionship, even newly offered, took on its own shape. She thought of Penny cool and untended, and of the stories she had yet to tell Abigail, and the ways in which teaching had been her lifeline. She thought, too, of the small seams of her identity that had been built on the assumption of children at a table, and how brittle that assumption had become. Jackson rode with her at first in companionable silence, then spoke. "There's a community bake on Sunday," he said. "Mayor Jenkins will be there with his hat on the wrong way, as always. Abigail insists we bring her rhubarb pie whether the town likes it or no." Grace let the small joke take. She pictured the mayor, an amiable man who tripped often, and felt a surge of affection for the town's peculiarities. "It will be good to be among people who know how to laugh," she said. "It is good sometimes to be counted in the ordinary ways." As they approached the Forrester ranch at dusk, the sky bled into a quiet violet. Jackson paused and turned to her. His face was softened by the day, and there was a gravity to his next words. "Miss Keller," he said, "I know that pity is numb and heavy, but I hope you'll believe that nothing I offer will ever be meant in pity. I offer work to be done together. I offer a place in a house where there is need and where laughter and sorrow mingle. If in time you think yourself worthy of more, tell me." It was not a proposal framed in the language of commitment she had once read about in novels. It was something less dramatic and more honest, practical, unmistakable, an invitation to share the burdens and the small delights of life rather than to solve the problem of lack. Grace found her lips shaping an answer she had not known she desired. She looked at Jackson and felt, in the precise way a map settles itself under a palm, that there were paths opening in the dust. "You are too generous," she said, "but I will not refuse the kindness of being offered a place at a table." He laughed softly. "Good enough," he said. They stood there then, as the light went out. The ranch house behind them was a pool of lamplight. Abigail appeared at the porch, turning a page with the seriousness of a person who had been deputized to declare the world intact. Mrs. Henderson waved a dish towel. The horses neighing in the stable were steady companions. Grace felt an odd surge of something like hope move slowly through her. It was not the feverish promise of a sudden ability restored, nor was it a naive belief that everything would be easily fixed. It was the quieter recognition that life would be different than she had thought, that the measure of family might not be wholly taken in blood, that there were other ways to belong. Jackson stepped forward and took her hand, then drew her into the porchlight as if to make the world small and permissible. There was a steadiness between them, the kind that builds slowly and without fanfare. He lifted his face, and with a tenderness that had the decorum of the age, pressed his lips to hers. It was a kiss that carried the weight of what had passed, the doctor's sentence and the years of widowhood, and the fragile possibility of what might come. Grace at first felt the reflex of surprise, then the settling of her shoulders, the easing of something in her chest. They did not need the violent language of passion. The kiss was deliberate, a mutual recognition of shared losses and the beginnings of shared solace. When their lips parted, the house around them remained the same, the porch light thrown across the boards, Abigail's book forgotten for a breath. Grace breathed in the night air and felt, as if from a distance, the soft peal of church bells calling to evening. The kiss changed the axis of the day. It did not solve the doctor's decree, nor did it promise an easy path forward. It did, however, tilt the world in a direction where tenderness might be possible again. She had not expected the permission to hope that a single sober kiss could grant. But as the storm had washed the world clean, and the house had filled with small acts of kindness, bread, clean clothing, a warm bed, so this small luminous act made a place in her chest where grief could sit beside the possibility of companionship. She felt both the ache of what had been taken and a new, almost pragmatic idea that a life might be built differently than she had imagined. Inside, Abigail clapped her hands softly and announced that she would make the rhubarb pie for the bake. Mrs. Henderson laughed and told them both to wash up. Jackson offered his arm with the sort of gentlemanly steadiness of a man who had learned to blend the public proprieties with private feeling. They moved into the house as if they were entering a second half of the day, companionably changed, the edges of their lives adjusted by the small rite performed beneath the forsythia light. The next morning, when Grace stood once more at the schoolhouse, chalk in hand and children gathered, she still bore Doc Morrison's words like a hidden ledger. But she also wore a new steadiness, not the false cheer that dismisses sorrow, but a pragmatic courage that made room for care. She no longer believed that the loss defined every possible future. She saw that there were other structures for a life: adoption and belonging, the fostering of small lives by hands that love them even when they are not of the same blood. She could not claim certainty. She could claim, for the first time in many months, a willingness to imagine a different kind of home. There were questions left between her and Jackson yet to be asked. What would her place at the Forrester table be in the eyes of Silver Creek, with its cautious eyes and its kindly gossip? How would Abigail, who loved the idea of a sibling as fiercely as she loved her plays, adjust to a new adult in the house? And how would the town receive a woman marked by such a private loss when she, nonetheless, made herself visible in its public rooms? For now, those questions lived in the space between them like small seeds. They would need tending. They would need the patient work of days. Grace understood that the diagnosis had not been erased. It remained as true and blunt as the line of a fence. But she had, by the grace of a storm, and a borrowed dress, and a man who had been steadier than she expected, been given a hand to hold in the dark. It might not be the life she had planned. It might, she thought as she walked the road home at dusk, be something that would teach her the better measures of patience and the unanticipated forms of love that make a house a home. For now, those questions lived in the space between them like small seeds. They would need tending. They would need the patient work of days. Grace understood that the diagnosis had not been erased. It remained as true and blunt as the line of a fence. But she had, by the grace of a storm and a borrowed dress, and a man who had been steadier than she expected, been given a hand to hold in the dark. If you love quiet period stories and gentle reckonings of the heart, consider subscribing. There are more like this to come. The Bake on Sunday was the sort of town event that made small communities feel larger than they were. Silver Creek came out to the green in a wash of hats and aprons, and even those who kept to themselves found reason to stand by the long tables and compare the merits of pie crust. Mayor Jenkins, as promised, wore his hat on askew and greeted neighbors with the theatrical modesty of a man who was fond of being noticed. Abigail, bright-cheeked and triumphant, carried the rhubarb pie as if presenting a trophy. She was suffered no nonsense about who would sample first. Grace moved through the crowd with a steadiness that felt new. People nodded. Some offered quiet condolences for the winter's losses, as if those conversations could be held alongside the day's merriment. Others, more practical, held platefuls of bread and a passing remark about how useful a good educator was to a town small as theirs. The gossip that had been said quietly at the boarding house, the town's curious weighing of who might pair with whom, settled into a background hum she did not try to hush. Where the gossip set its teeth, the kindness of neighbors rubbed it out. Jackson was there in the company of Abigail, watching with an indulgent patience that had become his custom. He met Grace at the table and offered her a plate as if it were a small ritual of welcome. There was a new ease in their exchange now, the kind that years of mutual tending make, a shorthand. He did not seek to possess her story. He had instead let it sit beside his own as an honest thing. Abigail, when she caught Grace's hand briefly under the linen table, squeezed it with the fervor of a conspirator. After the bake, neighbors drifted back to their affairs. Some afternoons the Forrester place was given over to the quiet labors of the ranch, others to small social rituals like sewing bees and card matches in the parlor. Jackson and Grace found that courtship, in their measure, was something made up of these small shared acts rather than any single grand moment. He walked with her to the schoolhouse sometimes, the mare following at an untroubled pace. He sat in the back pew at church on Sundays while she read the lesson aloud, his jaw soft with attention. They drove out to the creek on warm late afternoons and packed a small lunch, cheese and crust and thermos coffee, and let Abigail practice her lines until the creek hummed with her recitation. Grace taught the children new words, and in doing so, found the cadence of her life reassembling itself around useful work. Town life had its whispering corners. There were a few raised brows, a murmur of surprise when a teacher from town seemed to be spending so much time at the Forrester place. Some of it was curiosity. A little of it was the old notion that a woman who was widowed and evidently marked by loss might be seeking to secure herself by becoming attached. But the same mouths that sometimes harbored old judgments were the ones that rallied when Mrs. Henderson needed a hand bringing in hay, or when a neighbor's child fell ill. The contrast reminded Grace that Silver Creek was not a single thing. It was a mixture of sharpness and warmth, of appetite for gossip, and a readiness to help that might arrive at the door with a fresh Lent kettle. There were evenings when Grace and Jackson sat by the kitchen stove, Abigail curled near the hearth with a book, and conversation turned to the practicalities of a life shared. They spoke of simple matters, how the pantry should be laid out, which crops fared best the coming season, what books might be worth the trouble of ordering from the East. Jackson was plain-spoken about his expectations of marriage, clear duties, honest work, and a home where each member's gifts were welcomed. Grace, who had long framed herself in the measure of a teacher, found herself naming what she wanted out loud. "I want a round of mornings where I can have a kettle on and a ledger of lessons set," she said once, surprising herself at how easily the sentence formed. "I want to continue the school. Abigail ought to have a woman who reads aloud at night." He listened to these things as if they were the map of the land. "We shall make room for them," he said. "We will find a place to keep your books and a shelf by the stove. Mrs. Henderson will consider it a personal matter to have more knitting overseen." Abigail's approval was something that mattered and was freely given. She took to Grace with a possessive fondness, immediate, wholehearted. She would, in the dawning months, slip notes under Grace's door, try on hats from the upstairs chest, and parade them before the new aunt as if recruiting a confident ally. When they brought in new books, she read aloud with a solemnity reserved for scripture. The child's appetite for companionship was not merely about having a new adult around, it was the eager mouth of someone who had lost and wanted to refill the absence with laughter. Months settled in like weather. The little courtship rituals became ordinary. They walked to church together, they tended the garden side by side, they argued, once gently, over whether the new fence should be built along the old boundary or set slightly farther to allow room for a new orchard. When Grace laughed about something Abigail had said that morning, Jackson's face would arrange into a steady contentment that made her think of a house closing around warmth. The proposal came in the schoolyard in a way that seemed inevitable once it had happened, not because of any dramatic flourish, but because it was the town's most honest place to show intent. The children were dismissed, the sun was low, and the boardwalk creaked underfoot. Jackson had called for no grand speech. He had instead asked the town schoolmaster to mind the door, and then walked with Grace along the row of wooden benches where the old slate board hung. He took both her hands in his, an act that neither of them pretended was small, and spoke as one does when the townsfolk will soon be the witnesses. "Miss Keller," he said, using the name she had been called when she first arrived, and which had folded so easily into familiarity, "you have offered the town steadiness, you have offered Abigail kindness. If you'll have me, will you take this house and this table and try with me the work of making a family?" Grace saw how certain he was that the question need not fix her into a shape, how he had framed the request as partnership rather than rescue. In the small round of his hands she saw the practical truth of his life, tools and chores, and small, honest affection. She thought of Doc Morrison's sentence. She thought, too, of Emily's dress hanging in the closet and of Abigail's small, steady presence at the hearth. She felt the old ache, as present as an old scar, and also the possibility of other kinds of fullness. When she answered, her voice did not quiver. "Yes," she said, "I will try with you." The town made of a small wedding as much as it could. The church was modest, white weatherboard, a steeple that housed a bell with a cracked rim, and friends came with simple bouquets and pies for the reception afterward. Abigail wore a ribbon in her hair and marched with the solemn pride of one who understood the weight of ceremony. Mrs. Whittaker sent a shawl as a gift, and Mrs. Henderson oversaw a supper that meant to feed both appetite and nerves. There was no theatrical triumph, there was instead a steady weaving of two lives into one household. Grace's step into the Forrester house after the vows felt like a settling of a new pattern, as if the house learned the sound of another person's footsteps and then adapted to accommodate them. The first months of married life were a slow tempering of two routines into a shared rhythm. She rose early to prepare lessons and to lay plans for the schoolroom. Jackson left at dawn to check fences and feed stock. They met at the midday table and compared how the day had gone. Grace taught in the morning and came home to help with the accounts in the afternoon, and in the evenings they read aloud by the stove, sometimes reading Shakespeare while Abigail practiced her parts, sometimes choosing a more domestic book that spoke to baking and home mending. The Forrester house kept its habitual smell of coffee and hay, wood smoke and soap. Grace found, with a pragmatic joy, that she could indulge a small project, a shelf for borrowed books, and a corner of the parlor for the children of town to come and read on rainy afternoons. Half a year into their marriage, a letter arrived that would set the larger arc of their family into motion. It came in a small hand with the stamp of the postal route from Santa Fe. The paper smelled faintly of dust and far travel. The script was familiar, made by a former pupil of Grace's who had left Silver Creek 2 years earlier, and written occasionally from the South. The letter told, in careful and sorrowful sentences, of a widow who had taken in a baby after a difficult birth and then died before she could arrange care for the child. The widow's neighbors, uncertain of the law and with few resources, had asked the woman, Grace's former pupil, if she could find a permanent home for the infant. The note asked simply whether the Forrester house might consider taking a child in the stead of needing to send him or her to an orphanage in a bustling town where a child's life might be harder. Grace read the lines twice, then called for Jackson. He sat at the table and took the paper, the expression in his face folding into the practical seriousness that had become his habit in moments of decision. There was no instant certainty, there was instead a careful weighing. They considered Abigail's age and appetite for companionship, their capacity to care for an infant, and what the townsfolk might say. They wrote back to the correspondent, the pupil who had become a young woman with a household of her own in Santa Fe, and requested as much detail as the distance would permit. The child's name, if given, health, the details of the widow's death, and whether any of the neighbors would provide testimony of character. The letter came again with a name attached at last, Julia. She was described as a strong, alert infant with a head of dark curl and a cry that would announce herself at the first sign of hunger. There were small endorsements. The widow who had cared for her had been of good character. Mrs. Alvarez, a trustworthy neighbor, would attest to the child's steady condition. The writer ended with an appeal both practical and tender. If Miss Keller and Mr. Bolson Forrester could take her, I would be pleased to bring her to you, or we will arrange for you to come down. The child deserves a home where she is wanted. Jackson and Grace spoke of it long into the evening, long after Abigail had been coaxed to bed with the promise of a story. There was a pull that was not the naive substitution for what had been lost, and there was also a fear. What, if anything, might it mean to take on the care of a child not born to them when Grace's own body had been deemed unable to bear a child? They both understood what the doctor's decree signified. They also understood that parenthood is not only the matter of biology, but the steady practice of caring. They consulted quietly with Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Whittaker and the town's pastor, who wrote a brief line in support and offered to write a formal note that might smooth the matter with Santa Fe's neighbors. The town's voice, where it had been curious, now turned companionate. Abigail's delight, when she was told of the letter, was immediate and fierce. "A sister," she declared, with a gravity that made Grace laugh through tears. They traveled to Santa Fe by coach and then by a hired wagon for the last leg. The journey was long as a thought, and the landscape shifted as they went. Sage and dry arroyo gave way to an ochre city set like a stone above a desert. The woman who had written, Lena, the former pupil, met them, cheeks ruddy from the sun, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She offered no claim to the child beyond her transported care. She had tied herself to the matter with the earnestness of someone who owed the child a debt of kindness. Julia was quieter than any of them expected. She slept through part of the greetings, and at one point yawned with the solemnity of somebody newly formed. When she opened her dark eyes, they took in the room with a bright curiosity one might expect of an infant whose life had begun in sudden instability. Lena explained between small hesitations the circumstances. The widow who had borne and then fallen ill had asked for the child's safety before she died. Neighbors had tried to make arrangements, but no kin had come forward. Lena, remembering the kindness Grace had once shown her as a teacher, sitting with a small girl while she parsed a poem, had thought to write. There were formalities softened by humanity. Lena and the other neighbors wrote statements about the child's welfare and the widow's good intentions. The local pastor spoke with them, and a woman from the parish drew up a plain agreement of guardianship, a document less of law than of good witness. It was not a modern adoption proceeding with courts and long forms. It was a transfer framed in duty, testimony, and the backing of a community that would vouch for the child. Grace and Jackson accepted these papers with hands that trembled only a little. They promised to bring Julia home and to raise her as theirs in all the ways that mattered. The return home felt like a migration of hope. Abigail took the bundle and sat with it on her lap as if it were the world's greatest treasure. The county line fell behind them, and the Forrester place rose again like a familiar harbor. Mrs. Henderson fussed and laid a quilt out, and even the horses seemed to stir with the arrival of someone new, perhaps because the household had shifted in expectation and mutual attention. That first night, Grace held Julia in the small rocking chair by the stove and found that the child's fingers curled around hers with a trust that abraded, in the most healing way, the old edges of what had been lost. There were hard things, because infants make demands that are honest and immediate. Grace learned, with a trembling patience, the routines of diapering and warming milk by holding the bottle to the stove's residual heat. Jackson built a crib with his own hands, which sat near the corner of their bedroom. Abigail sewed small blankets and tied them with knots. The nights at first were unstitched by waking and feeding, and the new knowledge that a child's sleep is a household's weather. They fumbled names. "Will you see to her, Jackson?" "I will. I'll hold her while you rest." And these small exchanges wove them together. Grace found that she could name lullabies not in the way a mother must be born with songs, but in the way a teacher finds rhythm for a class. Steady metal, repeated lines that enforce both cadence and comfort. There were moments of private recognition that felt, to Grace, like an arrival. Once, leaning over Julia's sleep-smoothed face, she watched as the child opened her mouth and made a small sound like a question. Abigail, peering over the chair, whispered, "She likes when you read." So Grace read aloud, first in an unsteady whisper, and then with the same clarity that had steadied small heads for years. The words of stories and verse seemed to settle the child, and by extension the household. The new tasks that at first felt foreign, bathing, swaddling, coaxing a belly to settle, became work that she could do with the same competence she had brought to schoolhouse discipline. There were small public tests of their choice too. Silver Creek noticed that a baby had come to the Forrester place. Some whispered approval, others more curiously asked how an adopted infant would sit in the steady calculations of lineage and name. Jackson's straightforwardness mattered here. He met any talk with a look of such calm that most gave up the urge to pry. When a neighbor fretted over school board matters and then added in a low voice that the town must watch the child's upbringing, Jackson answered simply, "She will be taught to read, walk to church, and kept from harm. That, I think, is enough." Time, with its habitual patience, did what time does. Julia grew from a fragile bundle to a sturdy infant who would laugh when Abigail made little faces and would hold a spoon with both hands at the table. Her first tooth appeared like a small bright note. Grace watched these changes with the kind of attention that is the slow reckoning of love, marked not by a single triumphant proof, but by the accumulation of acts. Feeding, teaching, stitching a jacket for a sudden cold snap. The ache that Doc Morrison's office had left did not vanish. It remained, a particular kind of absent, but it was balanced by something else, the way a child framed a morning, the small domestic successes, the knowledge that she could give as fully as she was able. The years folded on. The community's shape adjusted too. People came to the Forrester place with small gifts and odd comforts, a basket of linens, a carved rattle, a shawl which Mrs. Whittaker declared very becoming for afternoons when Grace might be called out for a reading. Abigail's desire for a sibling eased into the richer companionship of having a sister who would, as she said one afternoon, learn to argue lines of Portia like a pro. Grace's teaching flourished. She added a set of simple lessons in sewing and homecraft that the larger girls found useful, and the schoolroom became, on rainy days, a place where children practiced reciting, and where Julia, once old enough, would be set in a corner to watch and learn, the way a sapling is set near a fence to learn the lines of shelter. The year that followed the arrival of Julia closed in a way Grace could not have predicted the day she left Doc Morrison's office. There were evenings when she sat on the porch swing, Julia asleep in her arms with a small fist curled against the neckline of her dress, and Jackson and Abigail moved inside arranging bread and the affairs of the kitchen. The sky over the cottonwoods poured its blue into violet as dusk arrived. The smell of cornbread came warm from the oven. Jackson stood in the doorway, the light making a small halo at his shoulders, and called out a question about the cornbread seasoning as if it were a serious debate. Grace looked at him and said, in the clear, unadorned way they had learned to speak to one another, "A touch more salt." He laughed and argued half a moment, then made the concession with a gentlemanly bow toward the stove. Abigail, from inside, insisted on a last-minute addition of molasses, and the household erupted into good-natured planning. The way they moved together in these small acts, arguing about seasoning, folding quilts, tending a child, felt to Grace like the assembling of a life by committed hands. She rocked a little, feeling both the old ache and the fullness concurrent in a heart that had learned to hold both. Julia shifted, a weight both light and absolute on her lap, and murmured in sleep as if thanking the world for a day's small kindnesses. Grace had taught children to read and to count, to understand how the world could be tamed by technique and care. She had once mapped a future by the possibility of birthing her own blood. Now she held a different certainty, that motherhood could be grafted into a life by acts, by nights kept, by the patience of small attentions. It did not cancel the loss. It redefined what,